Genocide. Denying the concept to the indigenous experience of the Western Hemisphere. Presentation by Mexica Movement, July 25, 2015. Presented by Citlalli Anahuac. Colonial Geography. October 12, 1492 marked the beginning of the European invasion of our lands. From this day forward, European invaders redefined our land, killed 95% of our population, and settled all over our continent. We do not honor European borders on our continent. Instead, we choose terms that come from our ancestors' languages, one of them being Nahuatl and others. Anahuac, Semanahuac, Tawantinsuyu. Those are the names of our land, not the colonial names that you see on the right-hand side. What do we know about genocide? Perhaps we know of the 6 million Jews killed by Hitler. Perhaps we know of the Armenian genocide. But why don't we know of our genocide? Our genocide as indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, branded as Hispanic, Latino, Raza, and Mestizo, colonially and nationally known as Mexican, Central American, Native, and South American. Why do we know about other genocides but not of our own? It's because we are on our own land and we are the survivors of this genocide, so they must keep us separated, disconnected to the ownership of this land. The image to the left is a graphic by the Mexica Movement that demonstrates each skull is a million. We have the Armenian genocide, the Jewish Holocaust genocide, followed by a representation of our genocide, where 70 to 100 million of our people were killed by white supremacy. What is genocide? Let's look at the origins of the concept. In 1944, a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin sought to describe the Nazi policies of systematic murder, including the destruction of the European Jews. He formed the word genocide by combining geno, from the Greek word for race or tribe, with cide, derived from the Latin word for killing. On December 9, 1948, the United Nations approved the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This convention establishes quote-unquote genocide as an international crime, which signatory nations undertake to prevent and punish. Raphael Lemkin studied the massive killings and invasion of Semanahuac in preparation for his concept of genocide. As he sought to give examples of genocide in the past, he looked at indigenous experiences to designate how indigenous people were treated by the methods of genocide. Quote, Lemkin evokes examples of genocide drawn from the Americas, where he puts into practice and continuously deploys the categories of analysis of the diagrammatic summary. In an essay on, quote, Spanish treatment of South American Indians, end quote, Lemkin, drawing in particular on the observations of Las Casas, successfully evokes, quote, the methods of genocide, the physical, which include massacre, slavery, and deprivation of livelihood. Family life was disregarded. Bread made of root meal was often the only food. When the slaves fell sick, they were left to die or at best sent home. The treatment of Indian women constituted an aspect of biological genocide, the death of the race, as he called it. Slave mothers, exhausted with hunger and fatigue, could not nurse their babies. Children were not infrequently carried off by the Spanish. Some Indian women were not only violated indiscriminately, but also taken to, quote, fill the harems of Spanish colonists. In terms of physical genocide, the population of the islands fell catastrophically. In the Bahamas, the population dropped from 50,000 to nearly zero. The population of Nicaragua was almost entirely wiped out. In 14 years, more than 600,000 had died as beasts of burden. Lemkin says Las Casas claimed that the total of the Indians killed in Spanish America exceeded 20 million. Lemkin adds that this number does not include those who died from overwork, the slaves killed in the mines, or the Indians killed during active combat, nor the prisoners who were executed, end quote. Raphael Lemkin's research designates why our ancestors' experiences should be known as genocide. It is not uncommon that academia continues to negate this concept to be addressed in expressing and defining the experience of indigenous people. In his 1944 book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, Raphael Lemkin wrote, that by genocide we mean the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. This new word, coined by the author to denote and note practice in its modern development, is made from the ancient Greek word genos, which is to race or tribe, and the Latin cide, which means killing. Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan to different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. Genocide is directed against the national group as an entity, and the actions involved are directed against individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national group. End quote. Genocide is defined as, quote, the planned annihilation of a national or racial group by a variety of actions aimed at undermining the foundations essential to the survival of the group as a group. Let us look at the specific details encompassing genocide and how it is applicable to our people. Genocide was broken into different categories. The first categories. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as A. Killing of members of the group. This was obviously done by the violence and biological warfare of smallpox. The violence and terrorism and slavery imposed on us by the Europeans fits this category. Smallpox biological warfare, the germs of genocide, was used throughout our whole continent, from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. Genocide using germs of genocide and smallpox and other lethal weapons of mass destruction were utilized. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. We see this in the smallpox example of our people's bodies oozing in pus of smallpox. From the mental damage of colonialism and genocide, from cultural genocide to the Indian schools, to the torture and execution of our leaders, to the persecution of our priests and priestesses, the mental damages of colonialism continue to this day. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The examples of indigenous people could be referenced as the cultural genocide of Indian schools, where we were separated, forbidden to speak our language, forbidden to practice who we were as indigenous people, forbidden our traditions. We also have an example of the braceros. The braceros were sprayed on with pesticides, openly sprayed on with pesticides. These effects of these pesticides continue to this day to the many victims of the bracero program and their physical harm that this caused them in their later lives. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. As Raphael Lemkin mentioned in his research, indigenous women were forbidden and their children malnourished, which give way to the decline in births of indigenous women. But a more contemporary example can be seen in the documentary that was recently produced entitled No Más Bebés. In 1960s and 70s, the Los Angeles Mexican immigrant women alleged that they were coercively sterilized without their consent in the LAC and USC Medical Center. Archival footage of the booming Chicano rights movement is juxtaposed with interviews in a long-abandoned hospital. Interwoven are opinions from both sides of the landmark case Madrigal versus Guillihan. The women who brought the case to trial are represented by a young and fearless lawyer, Antonia Hernandez. This is a documentary that everyone must watch. This population control and the actual preventing of births of Nicantlaca people continues to this very day. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This is demonstrated in the boarding schools and Indian schools, where our group of people, our children, were transferred to assist and to be living in other areas that they had no knowledge of, were disrespected, sexually abused, and many of them even died. This history is all too hidden from all of us to see and to learn from in our K-12 education. It is very important for us to emphasize that Raphael Lemkin focused on non-lethal acts of genocide. Genocide is not just the physical killing of a people. It is also the persecution, the destruction of their culture, their language, their identity, and their resources. Let us give an example of the actual non-lethal acts that also constitute genocide. Destruction of economic independence is genocide. We can see that with the stolen lands and stolen labor of our people. The destruction of our language is also genocide. How we are forced to speak Spanish and English and many other European languages, and how this process of conversion to these languages caused and disrupted the lives of our people. This was a fatal attack on our culture and language. The destruction of our worldview, of our theology. The destruction of our culture, where now we live as Europeans in these very colonized conditions of culture, where the indigenous remnants are very, very hidden from our view. The destruction of our education. We were the first people to have mandatory education, and now we are the people that are attending Indian schools, or known as K through 12, where we continue to learn Eurocentric education and Western ideals of colonization and white supremacy. Why have we been kept ignorant? Why don't we know this history? Why don't we know that we are the survivors of this genocide? Well, there were actual laws that were passed to keep us ignorant of this history. A decree of 1577 by King Philip II, he wrote a letter to the Viceroy Martin Enriquez. This was an actual law to keep us forbidden from learning our history, to keep us ignorant from learning who we are. The text of the decree reads, "As soon as you receive our decree, you must proceed with much care and diligence to seize those books without any original or copy remaining, and to send them carefully guarded at the first opportunity to our Council of the Indies, so that they may be examined there. Do not allow any person to write things having to do with the superstitions and the way of life of the natives in any language." End quote. This text demonstrates to you that they were forbidden indigenous knowledge, that they did not want us to know our history. We were being persecuted. We were dying in the millions. And those of us that survived were kept from our history, from knowing our true identity, our true accomplishments, and the greatness of our civilizations. Identity is power. Why are we called Hispanic or Latino? Why do they construct these colonial terms? The truth is, identity is power. If they keep assigning us white identities, they keep separating us from our true land and our true history. Our true identity connects us to this ancient continent. Our true identity connects us to this land that belongs to us. We are not Hispanic and Latino. We are not Latinx. We are not raza. We are not mestizo. We in the Mexica movement introduced the concept Nicantlaca. Nicantlaca is a term that comes from the Nahuatl language. It is not made up. It can be found in the many primary sources written, explaining and translating the life of our indigenous ancestors. To quote Olintezcatlipoca, the founder and director of the Mexica movement, who states, "The Nicantlaca term is not meant to negate the equivalent in any other of our languages. We encourage all of our people to use the equivalent in whichever of our languages they may want to use it. But for those of us who have lost our languages, who have lost our history and roots, we offer Nicantlaca, the people of this continent, Semanawak, the complete world between the waters, in the Nahuatl language." Identity. Identity is power, and it either gives you power to reclaim who you are, or it gives power to white supremacy. Choose wisely. Do not let yourself be used as a pawn of white supremacy and demographic control. We are not Hispanic or Latino. We are not illegals to this continent. We are Nicantlaca. We are full blood and mixed blood indigenous people to this land. We have to understand the demographic manipulation of these terms. The concept of Latino is not just about genocide and white supremacy. It also has to do with the exploitation of our population by manipulating the demographics to suit the Cuban Criollo attempts to exploit our populations. It has been an invention of Cuban Americans, advertising executives in South Florida and New York, who in the 1970s and 80s were eager to lump and homogenize small Latin American national group identities into a larger unitary market sector. If they could create a clearly identifiable, quote, Latino market, they stood to profit enormously. They could then persuade large group, beverage, and domestic product manufacturers that Latinos constituted a significant mass market that needed special advertising campaigns only these agents were expertly prepared to address. How convenient it was for the Cuban criollos and gusanos to create this concept. They, a very small minority of the so-called Latino umbrella, used this term to exploit the demographic power of our people. We must know our history. We must understand who we are. We must know that we survived this genocide. We have to decolonize our identity from Hispanic, Latino, raza, and mestizo. We need to acknowledge that we are the survivors of the world's largest genocide. We are the survivors of a genocide of 95% of our population. That means that we represent the 5%. This all took place on our own land. We didn't go anywhere else and experience this. We experienced this in our own home. We have to understand that our demographics are growing. We are reviving those of us that were killed. We were killed in the millions and we are returning in the millions. We must have a full awareness of our continuous presence on our lands. We must have a desire to recover and protect ourselves from further dehumanization. We have to decolonize our minds and our hearts. Do not allow yourself to be used as a pawn of white supremacy. Reclaim your true identity and heritage. We are Nicantlaca people. We are indigenous people. We are not Hispanic. We are not Latino. We are not raza. We are not mestizo. We are Nicantlaca. We are one people, one continent with no European borders. We are indigenous with the right to migrate everywhere on our continent. This is a message from the Mexica movement.